Good evening. Very warm welcome to everyone here at the German Institute for Japanese Studies in Tokyo, and also to everyone who joins us online. My name is Thorsten Weber. I'm a historian and principal researcher based here at the DIJ, and I will moderate tonight's DIJ forum for you. This year, throughout the world, we have commemorated the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Anniversaries like this one sometimes are not much more than occasions for media journalists, but also for historians to remind their audiences, or our audiences, of something that happened in the past that may or may not be terribly relevant for everyone else today. This year, my feeling is that there is something different from the usual special commemoration of anniversaries of the Second World War that takes place every 5 or 10 years. On the one hand, Russia's war against the Ukraine, and to some degree also Israel's war against the Palestinians in Gaza, served as reminders of how precious peace is. Suddenly, the experience of suffering, in particular of civilians, but also of soldiers in their often complicated roles as perpetrators and victims in the Second World War, seemed not as distant as 80 years. A second observation refers to the spatial scope of commemoration, and is also linked to today's lecture. This year, I was pleasantly surprised to see a lot of coverage in German and European media after May of the end of the Second World War, for example in Japan and East Asia. In fact, I myself was contacted by several German media outlets who asked me to comment about the end of the Second World War in Japan and on its continued legacy in East Asia. Not in May, but in August. And in one case, even for a special feature about September the 2nd in history, the official day of Japan's surrender, as we all know, which is not a date that is very familiar to many Europeans. Maybe this date, after the commemorations of the 80th anniversary, is now coming to an end, together with the 3 iconic dates in August 1945, are now at least a little bit less unfamiliar. The Max Weber Foundation, we at the Max Weber Foundation hope that we have also made a small contribution to this changing perception. Today's DIJ Forum is the last and closing event in the series The Ends of War, International Perspectives on World War II, organized by the Max Weber Foundation and its research institutes abroad. The DIJ is part of the Max Weber Foundation, but is very different from most of the other institutes that are historical institutes, whereas our institute is multidisciplinary. But today, and actually since a few months or maybe years, we are, for a change, not so different, as our director, Franz Waldenberger, just put it. We have several historians working at the Institute. We have several historians as PhD candidates affiliated with the institutes. And of course, we have 2 very prominent historians with us today for the DIJ Forum. Our sister institutes, many of them based in Europe, but also outside of Europe, in Washington, Beirut, Istanbul, for example, have contributed like ourselves, to the series The Ends of War. I invite you to check out our website to find out more about the contributions to this series. More than the series, today's talk, I assume, will make a strong case to put Japan back in the picture. Maybe even more centrally back into the picture of World War II history and historiography. Sheldon Garon, who will be our main speaker, is the Nissan Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Princeton University. A specialist in modern Japanese history, he also writes transnational global history. Awarded a European Research Council advanced grant, he currently directs a 5-year collaborative project, The Global War on Civilians 1905 to 1945, hosted by the Centre d'Histoire de Sciences Po in Paris. His publications include Molding Japanese Minds, The State in Everyday Life, Beyond Our Means, Why America Spends While the World Saves, and an article on the transnational destruction of cities, what Japan and the United States learned from the bombing of Britain and Germany in the Second World War, that appeared in Past and Present. His lecture will be followed by comments by Sebastian Conrad, who is Professor of History at Freie University in Berlin and a leading scholar in global history. He has widely published on issues of colonialism and post-colonialism, transnationalism, intellectual history, and historiography. His publications include What is Global History?, Globalization and the Nation in Imperial Germany, The Quest for the Lost Nation, Writing History in Germany and Japan in the American Century. We are very happy and very privileged to have Shell and Sebastian here at the DIJ tonight as speakers at our DIJ forum. Before we start, just a very brief technical comment from my side. The procedure for tonight is as follows. Professor Garon will speak for approximately 45 minutes, followed by comments from Professor Conrad, followed by a brief response. We will then open up to questions from the floor here at the DIJ and also from our online audience. To the online audience, I should say that please do type your questions, if you have any, in the Q&A chat. Camera, microphone, and chat are deactivated, but the Q&A function is activated. We are looking forward also to your participation. Thank you very much. Please, Shell, the floor is now yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Torsten, for that excellent introduction. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Barbara, and I want to thank Sebastian Conrad in particular for coming on very short notice. And you're going to see he's very relevant to the talk. And I want to thank everybody here for coming. I see lots of familiar faces, and I'm really honored by your presence. Well, as Torsten said, this is a significant anniversary. We are thinking about World War II, but hopefully we're thinking about it maybe in ways that have not been thought about before, about putting Japan much more centrally into the study of the Second World War. Now, Torsten mentioned that I am currently not in Princeton. I'm not really in Tokyo. I'm in Paris, where I will be off and on for the next 4.5 years because I have what other people in the room have had, a European Research Council grant, an ERC grant. It's a 5-year collaborative project, as he mentioned. And let me just say a brief word about it, and then I won't say too much more about it. It's called the Global War on Civilians. You can see it has a long time frame, even before the First World War, and you're going to see why that is. It is a project that is deliberately designed to be transnational and quite global. It has work packages, which if you're the 2 or 3 people in the room, you know what that is. It's just cases that go into an ERC project. In this case, we have Japan, which I'm covering. We have the Second Sino-Japanese War, which another team member is covering. We have Germany. We have Britain. We have the United States, not in its fullness, but just in a cameo role as the bomber and the blockader. We have the Spanish Civil War, Italy, France, the Soviet Union, and international law on war. So it's quite fulsome and fairly global, considering how World War II is usually studied. And we ask a very stark and timely question, which Torsten has already introduced us to. And basically the way I phrase the question, it's a sad question, how did it become normal in the course of the first half of the 20th century for nations to seek to win wars, not simply by destroying armies and navies, but by also attacking cities and civilians? And then on the defense against this, how did the war on civilians shape the creation of home fronts that would mobilize and protect civilians? Now, methodologically, we apply the techniques of global or transnational history to better understand these questions. So, the inevitable question, what is global history? And normally, I'm reduced to just showing this little slide, but tonight, I'm really, really lucky because I have a 3-dimensional, rather tall version of this slide in the person of Sebastian Conrad himself, who, if you haven't read it already, you really should read it. This is a wonderful, clearly the most authoritative book written to date on the techniques of global history or transnational history. And then I'm preempting a question from some of you. What's the difference between global history and transnational history? Well, in this case, not much. I mean, I'm using them interchangeably. We are studying movement of ideas, institutions, people, practices across borders and oceans. So whether you say you're a global historian or a transnational historian, you're basically doing that. Well, fortunately, Sebastian Conrad has given us a very convenient cheat sheet about how to do global history. And he calls it the 3 C's, which I think is wonderful. The first thing is connections. So we're very much talking about connected histories, things that are happening relatively simultaneously. We're not just talking about comparisons. We're not just talking about things in parallel. We're talking about links, connections, flows of ideas and practices. But Sebastian reminds us that to do global history well, you got to do more than just connections. You can do connections, and there have been some American historians who love to say, what's the image of Lincoln in the rest of the world? What's the image of Woodrow Wilson in the rest of the world? So you kind of focus on this flow, but you got to do more than the connection. You also have to do the next C, the comparison. In other words, you have to understand both sides of the flow. So let me give you an example. There are interesting books about the influence of Italian fascism on Japan. Okay. You can see all sorts of things about fascism in the media, but it doesn't mean that that connection leads Japan to be exactly like fascist Italy. So you've got to study the comparison as well. And the third C that Sebastian proposes is really important, causality, which I hope I'm interpreting him right, but I have my own. The way I interpret it is, does it help you explain things? Is there a value added? So much of scholarship, I hate the fact that we're on Zoom because now it means people are going to hear what I said. But so much of scholarship sometimes becomes kind of, for me, a navel-gazing. You just do it, and then people ask you, why do you do it? And you just say, well, I'm just doing it. There has to be, at least to my mind, I think Sebastian's mind, there has to be a reason for looking at these connections. You have to be able, in one form or another, if you're going to call yourself a global historian, you got to be able to use it usefully to explain things that you probably can't explain if you just did a nation-centered approach. Okay, so that is global history in a nutshell. Sebastian's going to, I'm sure, expand upon it, but now I want to get to the meat of the matter, the Second World War. Now, you would think that the Second World War would be the ideal topic for a global historian. True to its name, the Second World War was the most global conflict in history, and yet efforts to tell a globally connected story of the Second World War have been strikingly unsuccessful for various reasons. I'm not going to go into all the reasons, but the biggest reason, frankly, is that most global historians, okay, again, I hate the fact we're on Zoom, but most global historians are rather Eurocentric, okay? And they don't know how to handle the true globality of the Second World War, where one of the key belligerents was a non-Western society. Now, why can't they handle Japan? Well, one reason is kind of obvious. It's linguistic. It's amazing. Maybe some people will be able to show me I'm wrong, but I've surveyed a lot of the general and global histories of the Second World War, and I have not found a single one that uses Japanese sources or even uses that much Japanese scholarship, whether in English or in Japanese. And I just found myself wondering, would we tolerate somebody writing a history of the Second World War who couldn't handle German? I mean, it would just be inconceivable. So the linguistic is part of it, but I think it's more than linguistic. I think it's that historians of Europe and the United States have generally regarded Japan as culturally unique. And they will use words like fanatical, emperor worship, heirs to the samurai tradition, or Bushido. And I shouldn't do this, but I have to actually show you how this is done, because it's really, really annoying. Okay, so here's one that's particularly egregious. Gerhard Weinberg, he wrote a global history of World War II, and he was talking about why Japan in the end couldn't supply itself from its resources in Southeast Asia. And And he says the radical nationalists had not the slightest comprehension of the logistical problems of a modern industrial society. They knew how to use swords and guns, but beyond that, they were not only ignorant, they tended to look down on anyone who knew anything about subjects which they considered beneath the dignity of the exalted warrior. All right. I mean, I'm sorry, but Japan had the third largest merchant marine in the world, and logistically, things broke down at the end, but it was quite amazing what they did before that. They kind of knew what science and technology was. Okay, and so I'm just going to give you 2025, just a couple of things I picked out. Okay, Anthony Beevor, he's a very famous historian of the Second World War. I mean, good books. Not on Japan, but okay, but that doesn't stop him from having an opinion. Okay, so what did he say in the recent issue of Foreign Affairs? The atomic bombs may have saved many more lives than they took. Japanese generals wished to fight on, and they were prepared to sacrifice millions of Japanese civilians by forcing them to resist an Allied invasion with only bamboo spears and explosives strapped to their bodies. I don't know what he's talking about. There were some fantasies that the Army had. There was even kind of a dumb blueprint for drafting 28 million people, civilians, into civilian fighting corps, but they waited months and months and months. They even waited past the Battle of Okinawa, and the first units, which were never actually put into any combat role, weren't organized until July. Okay, it was really, really tepid. I'm not sure it was a good reason to use atomic bombs, but be that as it may, it's just, this is a fantasy that there were millions of Japanese out there ready to have explosives strapped to their backs. In fact, most of them were running away to the mountains. Now, there was a country that did actually draft its civilians in the hundreds of thousands and millions, and that was Germany, and it was called the Volkssturm. This was serious. This is the last 10 months of the war. Drafted males between 16 and 60. These are rather nice pictures of what it looked like. It didn't look this nice at all. And hundreds of thousands of them were butchered, particularly on the Eastern Front. So if I was following Beevor's logic, I guess we should have actually instead used the atomic bombs on the Germans because they had a Volkssturm. But then again, I'm at the DIJ, and it's probably not the most diplomatic thing to say. So be that as it may. But, I mean, you can just see the distortion of Japan and the refusal to actually think comparatively and transnationally. And then the third one I really shouldn't do because it's by Richard Overy, who's a very, very good historian, and in other books has taken Japan very seriously. But he has a kind of throwaway line in the last chapter. For all Japanese efforts to imitate and learn from the West, in the 75 years since the founding of the Meiji era, Japan remained a fundamentally different society and polity from the enemies it faced in the Second World War. Well, the second part of the sentence I don't even want to deal with because, yeah, they weren't like Britain and the United States, but I mean, not a lot of information in that sentence. But it's the first part of the sentence that really gets me. And I'm thinking of Andy Gordon, who has this wonderful textbook called A Modern History of Japan. Imitate and learn from the West, but it was like all a deep fake, okay? It wasn't real. Okay, well, this doesn't make sense to those of us who are historians of Japan. As I said, in fact, Japan is a rapidly urbanizing, technologically advanced society with the world's third largest navy, third largest merchant marine, advanced air forces, highly developed home front. It doesn't make sense to talk about the Japanese in some exceptionalist way. Moreover, I would argue that Japan was a central player in the transnational development of ideas and practices that shaped home fronts and total war. And in the rest of the talk, I want to present 4 episodes or moments that I believe illustrate the benefits of including Japan in a global history of the Second World War and society. So the first episode is the Russo-Japanese War. This will be familiar to some of you. The Russo-Japanese War, as some of you know, was the largest war between 1871 and 1914, the First World War. It was much observed by Western journalists, military officers, doctors, nurses, and others, and many Westerners reported back on the lessons that their own society could learn from Japan and the Russo-Japanese War. Now, the best known example of something that spread around the world was actually Bushido, which there are books about, very interesting. Japan was deemed by Western journalists to have won the war because of Bushido, and that this wasn't a Bushido just for the samurai, but it applied to all the Japanese people. And this really spread like wildfire, particularly in Anglo-Saxon societies, particularly in Britain. This is H.G. Wells, writes a book called Modern Utopia at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. And his guardians of utopia are called the samurai. The Boy Scouts, the founder Baden-Powell was very much inspired by Bushido. He said, we have to do a version of Bushido in England. We have to restore the chivalry that we had. So this permeated revitalization and masculinization. But if we dig a little deeper, there are two areas that I think there were very important transnational lessons, or perceived transnational lessons from the Russo-Japanese War. And one was really the discovery and reinforcement of the importance of military morale, of soldiers' morale. And this was reported particularly by the British, but also the French and others. This is a very prominent British general, was attached to Japanese forces at the time, Hamilton. And he said what a lot of people said at the time, that he had admiringly observed that Japanese troops, it wasn't strategy or tactics or armament, but the souls of the Japanese troops compared to the Russians, that Japanese soldiers would charge into the face of fire. So these are conscript soldiers, combining moral and physical qualities. And moral here is actually the British rendition of what Americans would call morale. So this is, and what's interesting is just like Bushido, this could be imported back to England. So England too could draw on its own old warrior spirit and teach them, initiative, quickness, intelligence, and basically raise their morale. So that was one lesson, that you needed to, now that in the age of mass armies, you needed to motivate people. A second lesson was the need to mobilize civilians. So the Japanese got very high marks from Western observers, again, particularly the British, for mobilizing their civilians behind the Russo-Japanese War. And this was a famous book at the time, Great Japan, A Study in National Efficiency by a journalist, Alfred Stead. And he makes the point that the Japanese are very patriotically supporting the war effort, savings movements, bringing their metals in to be recycled, sending troops off, and then this wonderful statement, in Japan, no atlas is left to bear up the skies. Every man, woman, and child is ready and proud to share the task. Now, is this totally a real description of Japan? Things are a lot sloppier, but it is an image that Stead and others want to transmit back to their own country to revitalize them, to revitalize Britain in a time when it feels it's losing out to Germany. It's been humiliated in the Boer War. So what we have is we have these lessons. It doesn't mean that what the transnational learners say is totally accurate, but it feeds into their sense of problems in their own society, and it feeds into a circulation of ideas. So the Japanese don't have to be the prime mover in everything, but they are very important in contributing to this new circulation of knowledge that talks about the mobilization of civilians, that talks about the importance of ordinary soldiers' morale. Okay, so that's the first case, or the first moment. The second one is the First World War, when Japanese, both military and civilian ministries, are very active in sending teams of investigators, particularly to Europe, a little bit to the United States at the end, but particularly to the European belligerent countries. And this is the ones that they're allied with, but they study Germany from very close, from Switzerland and other places. And the army is the most forceful, but the civilian ministries do it as well. And this is a period when particularly the Japanese army comes up with very sophisticated reports on really distilling the common experience of mobilization of both troops and civilians in Europe. And in some ways, I mean, this is an argument, it's not my argument, it's actually Jan Schmidt, a German scholar who teaches in Leuven, has a wonderful book on this. But in a sense, because the Japanese investigators go from country to country, they kind of manage to distill what's common between all these things. They see these common developments of the First World War, and it's really the Japanese, particularly the army officers, who distill the idea of total war actually years before it becomes a common phrase in Europe itself. And so they by 1918, they're already talking about national total mobilization and demanding the patriotism and spirit of sacrifice of all the people. And then they observe, and again, sometimes they impose their own aspirations, but they observe the Europeans are engaged in the mobilization of morale. And morale and spirit are used interchangeably. And so for those of you who study later something in the late 1930s in the China War about the spiritual mobilization movement, that language is actually coming straight out of what Japanese army officers observed in the First World War. Well, other things they observe that become extremely important both in the interwar period in Japan, but also to Japan's own efforts to mobilize itself for total war in the Second World War. What are some of the lessons? Well, one of the lessons is the importance of mobilizing factory labor, either recruiting them or conscripting them. But another lesson is a cautionary tale. About maintaining one's food supply, the civilian food supply, and they point, like lots of people at the time, to the catastrophe and the collapse of the Imperial German home front because of a number of reasons, but food shortages, everyone agrees on that. Were they caused by the British blockade or not? People don't agree on that, but the point was the food supply broke down in Germany. It caused a collapse in morale. It caused regime change. It did this in Austria-Hungary and did it in Russia too. And so this becomes a cautionary tale for the Japanese, being an island nation, and particularly important to the Japanese because they have their own food riots at exactly the same time. The famous rice riots, which we always look at in isolation in Japanese history, but they're very integrated into this overall, this almost universal anxiety of particularly ordinary people, working class people facing high cost of food, rioting, and even overthrowing their governments. Japan, the Japanese investigators feel themselves very much drawn into this global experience. Other things that they learn, the mobilization of women. Japanese investigators came back thinking that the Japanese state had heretofore relied mainly on household heads, male household heads, and not very much on ordinary women, adult women. And so one sees coming out of this, they see what's happening in England, France, Germany, etc., that women are playing a crucial role in the mobilization of the home front. So that's another important lesson that affects Japan at home. Savings campaigns, how you raise money quickly from the savings of your people. Some of you know I wrote a book about this, but there too, you can just see kind of graphically, they see all these posters and campaigns, and they, in the interwar period, start setting up very similar campaigns with actually even fairly similar iconography. So that's another thing. And then one of the things that they observe with great apprehension is a lot of these Japanese officers and officials happen to be in London and Paris when they're bombed by these big German bombers called Gotas. And they witness this. They witness the panic that happens in Paris and London. You can see this postcard of Paris. And they very quickly project, if this happens in a place that has, brick and stone buildings, what's going to happen when the enemy firebombs a city like Tokyo that's made of wood and paper, and is it not going to eviscerate civilian morale? So they're very much part of this world, and it's interesting because of these experiences in observing home fronts. By the late 1930s, because Japan will be the first of the major nations that's involved in a big war, Japan actually becomes one of the first major home fronts in the late 1930s. So it now is observed by others. So this is from the German civil defense magazine, Sirene, and very much lauding how the Japanese seem to be very well prepared. And you can see there's also this kind of interchange between the German and the Japanese civil defense magazines with, again, similar iconography. Now we move to the third transnational episode, and that is the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan's war in China, that starts in 1937. And it's very interesting that this war is generally treated by historians as a distant regional war, not really part of global things. But again, like the Russo-Japanese War for its time, the Second Sino-Japanese War was by far the largest war between the two world wars, between two large nations, and it too was much observed, even more observed by Western observers who were resident in Chinese cities that were being bombed. So Western journalists, businessmen, missionaries, military attaches, medical personnel. So it's very much reported. It's not a distant war. World opinion is very much focused on it, and what they're very much focused on is Japan's unprecedented bombing of cities. So nobody to date, even in the First World War, had bombed cities as much as the Japanese bombed in the Second Sino-Japanese War. There were many raids that involved 50 bombers, sometimes even 80 or 90 bombers. It horrified the world. It had a transnational significance. Well, here, you can just see in this slide, what's interesting is how the Japanese have imbibed a lot of the transnational lessons of what was called strategic bombing, that the big target is enemy morale. Just the way that they're now talking about these things is part of this transnational circulation, terrorizing civil population, et cetera, and the bombing of Chongqing. So we have this event, again, something rather unprecedented, but something that's very much linked to global history. And it's interesting that there are many transnational histories that come out of it. And one is on the international peace side, and the anti-bombing movement is quite strong, particularly centered on Western Europe, but a lot of vociferous condemnations. But there's another interesting transnational movement that happens as a result of the Japanese bombing, is that air forces in the West want to know, they want to learn from the Japanese. The Japanese are the first to really try and destroy cities and destroy morale, and Western air forces want to find out if this is possible. So this is the opposite of the peace people. They want to do the aggressive, the offense side. And it's interesting, I just show a couple of publications, these are secret publications. Britain's Committee of Imperial Defense organized a subcommittee which issued 5 different reports, lengthy reports, on the air lessons from the simultaneous Second Sino-Japanese War and the Spanish Civil War. The British weren't that interested in the bombing of the Spanish Civil War, even though we think Guernica and things like that are iconic. They were much more interested in the Japanese bombing because it was much more extensive and actually tried to do things like break morale. In the end, the British concluded that the Japanese were kind of second-rate, at least that's the word they used, and worse than that, the British concluded that bombing China wasn't going to do much because, you can see the quote here, China's civilian population was too dispersed and elementary in structure to respond to moral pressure. In other words, you could bomb people in Canton and they weren't going to overthrow Chiang Kai-shek's regime. Now, I am neutral on this statement. I'm not agreeing with it, but this is what they reported. Well, we move now into the last of the episodes, and that is the U.S. onslaught against Japanese civilians, particularly in 1945. So everybody remembers the atomic bombs, but there was also the fire bombings. I think most of the people in the room know it here, but most other people don't really know it. The fire bombings of 64 other Japanese cities, notably Tokyo, in March 1945, in which in one night, I think the most accurate estimates now are 105,000 people died in one night, making it pretty much comparable to Hiroshima. Well, historians, when they talk about this, when they try and interpret the ferocity of the U.S. onslaught on civilians, they tend to treat it as an exceptional episode, something that's detached from what's happening in the rest of the war. And they do this in two different ways. They make the case that Japan is exceptional. The way the U.S. bombs is exceptional. And they do it in two ways. So many American historians, certainly not nobody in our crowd, but many American historians believe that Japanese leaders were so fanatical, and if you throw in the people too, they were so fanatical that there was really no alternative but to use this ferocious air power, whether it was atomic bombs or firebomb. So that makes it exceptional. And the second thing that makes it exceptional is one that we know a little better, the argument that Americans bomb Japan in a different way, a much more ferocious, atrocious way because of racism. And this is the argument famously made way back by John Dower, and frankly, I think it's kind of the gospel in the field, and it's spread to other historians of the world as well. This argument is taken very seriously. I find it in almost every book I read, that racism explains why the so-called greater ferocity of the U.S. against Japan. The problem is that if one takes a transnational perspective, one actually sees a much more connected history between the European and the Asian Pacific theaters. I would argue, and these are incendiary words, just like the bombs, but that the attacks on the Japanese people were not exceptional at all, but the culmination of this long transnational war on civilians. And how can I possibly argue this? Well, the U.S. Army Air Force, the one that has all the bombers over Japan, they are in many ways transplanting lessons that they learned in the bombing of Europe to Japan. So this is not the way military historians see it. They tend to see that, in Europe, the American bombers, unlike the British, were engaged in this really precise this precision bombing with these wonderful Norden bomb sites, and they were appalled by British area bombing and incendiary bombing, and they didn't do that. But when they got to Japan, suddenly they switched because they're racist and because the Japanese are fanatical, crazy people. But that's not the way it works. The U.S. Army Air Force was learning a lot in Europe from their British allies, and they were learning what they considered the utility of area bombing. What is area bombing? It's what you could call, in a not so nice way, indiscriminate bombing. You just drop your bombs in the middle of a city, and you don't care what you hit as long as it's people and built up areas. Okay, so can we actually prove this? Yeah. Curtis LeMay, some of you have heard of him. He was the Air Force general in charge of the B-29 bomber campaign against Japan in 1945. But he was a younger general in Germany in 1943, and I found this wonderful document in the Air Force archives. At one point, General LeMay sent 300 B-17 bombers to wipe out the two German cities of Münster and a smaller place called Coesfeld. Has anybody ever been to Coesfeld? Oh, good. So it exists. Okay. I never heard of it, but it got bombed. I knew that. Okay. But the document is fantastic in the sense that here's LeMay and his commanders saying that the built-up area is the main thing to hit. What's the built-up area? It's where everybody lives, okay? It's the densely populated place. The RAF has not been able to eliminate these two densely populated areas as they have in other towns in this section of Germany. Practically all the workers live in these areas of the town, and the idea is to wipe out the built-up area and disrupt the people as much as possible. And then there's this line that's kind of crossed out It's actually an edit for the next version. This is definitely an area bombing job instead of a precision target job. Why was it deleted in the next one? Because the gospel was that only the nasty British actually did area bombing, but clearly the Americans were doing it. So LeMay and others are learning, they're transplanting this, and that we should really stop thinking of these campaigns being different. So historians today are not very transnational, but the bombers are really transnational, particularly the Americans, because they're bombing in 2 different theaters, and they're bringing what they learned. Well, there's one more part of the 4th episode, and then I'll bring this to a close. Transnational history, I would argue, also helps us to uncover another facet of the U.S. war on Japanese civilians, one that is not known at all, I mean, very little, and that is the blockade, the Allied blockade of the Japanese civilian food supply. It occurs between 1943 and 45. It's actually a 2-part blockade. It starts with an Allied naval Air Force blockade against food and raw materials coming from Southeast Asia and Taiwan, in other words, coming from the south, and long maritime routes. But in the last 5 months of the war in 1945, it enters a new phase that was called officially Operation Starvation, okay? And this was the aerial mining. You can see the map here, particularly the area around the Straits of Shimonoseki, in other words, the gateway from the Northeast Asian food supply, which was keeping Japanese people alive at the time, that had to go through the straits in order to get to all the big cities in the inland sea, et cetera. And also, they mined up and down the west coast of Japan. Now, I used to, when I first encountered this term, Operation Starvation, I don't know, I must have still been in patriotic mode. I thought, I'm sure it's just a metaphor. But it wasn't. They really meant starvation, as the report sums up here, the after-raid report. Enemy industry would be starved, yep, but the enemy population would be reduced to starvation. The effect of starvation would combine with the incendiary raids, the firebombing raids, to reduce the civilian will to wage war. That's morale. Therefore, it's called starvation. Food alone, difference of cutting 20 to 30% was the difference between actual subsistence and starvation for a large part of the population. In the final phase, you can read it, blockade was complete and Japan was doomed to starvation. Okay, so sometimes people say I'm a little harsh for using a word like war on civilians. That's a war on civilians. Okay. Well, let me wrap up with a conclusion, a very short one. Let me be clear. I am not arguing that we replace Eurocentrism with Japan-centrism. I'm not arguing that understanding Japan means we're going to understand what causes everything. That's not my point. On the contrary, in global history, there's rarely, I would argue, a single origin, but rather we see a circulation, multi-directional flow of ideas and practices. And I have argued tonight that Japan was both a taker and a maker of this transnational knowledge, and its inclusion in global history, I would argue, allows us to ask better questions, even of the so-called core cases. Now, I've been critical tonight of Eurocentric historians for not taking Japan seriously, but I can't end like that because I think we historians of Japan also bear some responsibility. We haven't done that much to reach out. We haven't done that much to integrate our studies into a more transnational history of the Second World War, and I think that this is actually a good time for both camps to think more collaboratively about this most global of wars. Thank you.
And now I would like to ask Professor Conrad for his comments.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me. Thanks, Sheldon. I knew it was going to be an action-packed talk. It was great, great fun. Does anybody remember Edwin Saar, who in 1970 produced one of the best-selling hit singles of the whole decade? It was called War. And essentially, you know, it was probably the easiest song to sing along in a karaoke because it has almost no range. And it essentially goes like this: war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. And in many ways, we could say that this is what actually global historians, you know, do with war. They don't think it's good for anything, and it's good that you bring the topic back in. It is strange, but global historians have essentially avoided the topic of war, even though in many ways we could say, as you showed today, that war is one of the most transnational phenomena there is. In fact, for example, when people talk, they talk about mobility, migration, but they don't talk about the soldiers who, in their campaigns, they really make transnational experiences. They're just not the kinds of experiences that global historians like. The term global usually, at least for a while, it's changing now. It's changing. It's been changing for the past few years, but for a long time, the global essentially, connoted something that was positive, that was good, that was expanding and moving beyond borders. But now, and war simply didn't fit. It seemed like something almost anachronistic, something that in this new world of globalization would eventually disappear. It's actually interesting to note that also social theory doesn't really make much of war. For most social theorists, again, war is almost an embarrassment. It's not something that they seriously look at. And just a few people, like, for example, Michael Mann, remind us that many of the phenomena we look at, the emergence of fascism, of communism, the emergence of US hegemony, decolonization, all of that probably wouldn't have happened without war. Also, this recent book by Walter Scheidel on the Great Leveler, showing that if we look at the history of inequality across human history, it is actually war that produces equality more than anything else. At least that's his argument. I'm not fully buying it, but essentially the point would be global historians have avoided the topic of war, and it is important to bring it back in. Shal, thanks for doing this for us. But you're not only bringing war back in, but you're also bringing Japan back in. Now, in the case of the First World War, it took about a full century before historians actually realized that World War I was actually a world war. And there's now a substantial literature on this. So one question could be, World War II, we still have a way to go before it's 100 years. So what is it we can learn from this literature on World War I? Is that a model that we can follow? Well, we've certainly learned a lot, I think, tonight. You showed us very convincingly that Japan is not the odd one out. It's not a unique case, not a case of exceptionalism. Japanese learned from Europeans and Americans learned from Japan. It's also not simply a back and forth, but it's actually, as you, I think, showed very convincingly, it's a very tight net of knowledge production, of also practices that are adopted, appropriated. It's really a plea to look at, in this case, World War II holistically, and I think it makes a lot of sense and is very convincing. So what I'll add is simply three small questions along the lines of your overall question, namely, what does including the Japanese case yield beyond what you already said? So the first of these questions would be, the Second World War was clearly also a war of empires. It was an imperial war. It was fought by empires. It was fought partly in the name of empires, partly in the name of anti-imperialism, like as in the Japanese case. So I suppose when looking at World War II and including the Japanese case, does this also produce a different picture on this war as a war of empires? So the imperial aspects of war, let's say Italy in Ethiopia, Ethiopia, the Nazi empire, as Shelley Baranowski called it, Japan in, let's say, Indonesia and so forth. Will this have to be more prominent if we look at World War II globally? Think of the recent book by Daniel Hediger, who makes this case. Think of ongoing work by David Mottadell and others. So if it would be my question, would not including Japan make it easier for us to understand that the war was actually a war of empire? In fact, it was a war that in many ways led to decolonization, generated the conditions in which decolonization could happen. So my sense would be that if we include the Japanese case, where the imperial dimension is so much more obvious than, for example, in the German case, because the Germans don't like to call this an imperial dimension, even though it is. But the Japanese case really prompts us and invites us to look at this in this, within this framework, and that could also help us rewrite the history of World War II. So this would be one question. I mean, empire, of course, immediately invites the question of race. You had a very strong statement on this. I found it very interesting. At the same time, I'm not sure if we still have Dower's book, right? And we do know that campaigns to dehumanize the enemy happened in all these countries. So race and racism was very prominent. So can we still, from this one very sort of technical strategist, can we infer that this was not a racist war or a race war, as Dower called it? Certainly, also when looking at the way in which the Germans treated, people in Belarus, Ukraine, and so forth, it's very obvious. So, my sense would be that this should be center stage much more. The second question is one of, and it's really a question of sort of long-term perspective. If you look at warfare, then up until World War I, the majority of the casualties, even on the battlefield, was not produced by guns or weapons, but essentially by disease. And it's probably World War I when that changes for the first time, I think. But then what you showed and made clear is that very quickly, already with the Second World War at the latest, casualties are primarily probably civilians through these bombings. So could we put this into sort of a long-term perspective? Also, I'm wondering, the war on civilians that you described for World War II, was that not in many ways a war that was still focused on the front, meaning, yes, they targeted the civilians, but the civilians were sort of the means to weaken the front line. While, if I compare to, let's say, the Vietnam War or now the war in Gaza, it seems that it is actually the civilians who are the real targets, seen as the real enemies. The Vietnamese villages where everyone is a potential communist and therefore is a legitimate target, and similarly in the recent war in the Near East. So I'm wondering, could we turn this into? Are there different moments? Could we periodize, in other words, this war on civilians by looking at the logic that's behind it? I don't know if you have anything, if that makes any sense to you. Well, the final point would be memory. I know it's not your favorite field, but at the same time, it is clearly important also in this case. Clearly, in both in Germany and in Japan, the memory of the bombing has been hijacked by revisionist and right-wing groups, right? So the right-wing parties on the right in Germany, they like to point to the to the firebombing on Dresden. The Showa Khan, for example, essentially shows the Japanese subjected to bombing that seems to come out of nowhere. So how do we, is that something to consider when writing a history of bombing, how sort of the longer history of it turns perpetrators into victims? Is that an almost inevitable part of the story would be my third question. And I'm sure there's about 58 additional questions in the room on top of that, so thank you.
All right, I was asked to respond to Sebastian, but I know that many of you have questions, so I'm going to be very, very brief. Because you'll probably want to follow up on some of his questions. Well, so what does including Japan do? Well, a lot of things, but why don't we focus on the thing you brought up, the empire? And I think you and I probably agree on this. It is amazing how, whatever we call it, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, how it's been very much not included in the accounts of Nazi occupations, and it seems somewhat different in some respects. Pan-Asianism is clearly much more real than anything. Well, there isn't a very strong Pan-Germanism except among certain groups in the Nazi Empire. So that's a difference. And in terms of decolonization, it's an interesting story. One has to be very careful. I'm not calling the Japanese liberators the way right-wing people may do, but nonetheless, we know that there were various Japanese interests in the military, sometimes in the Navy, sometimes elsewhere, that actually linked up fairly closely with various nationalist leaders in Southeast Asia. And we know that the Bandung Conference is a pretty interesting anomaly, a conference in 1955 that is based on anti-imperialism, and they invite Japan. They don't invite Britain, they don't invite America, they invite Japan. So there's something very interesting and complicated, and it would really be nice if our colleagues who study Europe included that. David Motadel has kind of made a little start, but he could go further. So I do think there's a lot of things we could do in decolonization, very, very important in that. So the racism, I should probably never open my mouth on this, but I'm not making the claim that racism is unimportant, okay? I am making a very specific claim that everybody thinks that Japan was atomic bombed because of racism. John Dower and others argue very forcefully. Napalm, napalm was developed during this time. We think napalm, we think Vietnam, we think it must be used against Asians. We think that incendiary bombing can only be used against Asians. And I'm just saying this is not the case, okay? Racism exists. There's no doubt that probably every bomber who bombed Japan probably was a racist, okay? And they were much less racist toward Germany, but they dropped the same firebombs, okay? That's what we have to come to grips with. So the racism cannot be a sufficient explanation the way I think all too often it has been. When you get to fighting in Southeast Asia, even Dower's point, there's a lot of racism, but there could be other factors in the brutality of that. There could be Japan's rather stupid policy of no prisoners. They made that policy. That made the Americans much less willing to capture Japanese prisoners and to also fight to the death. It can be tropical conditions. It can be all sorts of things that are going on. So we can't just slide so easily into racism as a one-size-fits-all explanation of things. So that's the only thing I'm saying. But on the bombing thing, I want to be really clear. Analytically, it just doesn't explain much. The bombers are racist, but it doesn't matter. They dropped the same bombs. Okay. One thing, Sebastian, I would differ a little bit. What's interesting about the Second World War, particularly in the Pacific, but also in Europe, is the strategies of the Allies are to go straight to the homeland. And that's different from the First World War. So the Americans might have done a lot of different things in the Pacific. They might have engaged with. I mean, they did to the Philippines in the end, which was a bad idea. But they might have engaged with Japanese troops more forcefully in Southeast Asia. They might have fought them in China. But their strategy was very coherent. Go straight for the homeland. Go north in the Pacific. Get within bombing range. Take Okinawa. Get within invasion range. They really are trying to break down the homeland, both economically and in terms of morale. So it is a different war. It's not the front the way we think about in the First World War. And even in even in Europe, there are fronts, but they move much faster, and the target is the German homeland. So getting to the homeland is a very important part of the Second World War. So in that sense, that's one of the ways I'm using war on civilians. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense. And memory. Memory's really complicated on the bombing story. So I've been in Dresden. So what's interesting is when you think about, in Germany, it is generally the far right that wants to commemorate bombing, particularly Dresden, because it's in East Germany. Hamburg, much less so, because it's in West Germany. But think about Japan. Who is it that commemorates the bombing? The left wing commemorates the atomic bombings. It was civil society groups in Tokyo in the 1970s on the left who commemorated the firebombing of Tokyo. So it's not the same configuration. And it's very interesting. The memory is different. And I think also the wariness of ever saying that the United States actually drops these bombs. And that was your point about the Showa-kan. It just seems like bad weather came up on the Japanese, not U.S. bombers. So I think that's all I'm going to say for now, so we have more questions.